The headlines are buzzing, the markets are on edge, and everyone's asking the same question. What do these new tariffs really mean for us? From grocery bills to global trade wars, from job security to stock market jitters, the ripple effects are everywhere. Today, we're breaking it all down. No jargon, no political spin, just the facts, the stakes, and what it all means for you. Stay with us, because this is one deep dive you won't want to miss.
All right, so let's dive into these tariffs. You've given me a lot to work with here. White House statements, economic analyses, even some pretty intense conversations from investors online. Seems like everyone's kind of scrambling to figure out what these new tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and China actually mean.
Yeah, and it's fascinating to see how this move is shaking things up globally.
Yeah.
We're already seeing reactions, and it really feels like we're just at the beginning of this whole thing.
I agree. And then there's that fact, up to 40% of the produce in U.S. grocery stores, it's imported, right? Adds a whole other dimension to this. It's not just numbers and economics. It's about what people are putting on their tables, how much they're paying for it.
Exactly. So before we get to all the potential outcomes and all that, let's just lay it out what these tariffs are. Basically, we're looking at a 25% tax on a huge range of goods from Canada and Mexico. And China, well, they're getting hit with a 10% tariff.
And then there's that whole thing about energy resources from Canada being taxed at a lower rate. But even the experts are like, what exactly does that include?
It's definitely a bit unclear. Now, the White House, they're saying these tariffs are about a few things: stemming the flow of illegal drugs and immigrants, bringing in more revenue, strengthening U.S. manufacturing, and basically pushing these trading partners to come back to the negotiating table.
But some of the economists in these reports, they're not so optimistic. They're predicting a food tax, because of higher prices. Then there's inflation, which could push the Federal Reserve to raise interest rates. And then there's the whole mess of supply chain disruptions, especially for industries that really depend on that cross-border trade.
Right, like the car industry. Those supply chains, they're woven all across North America. Any disruption there, and it could ripple through the whole thing.
And it's not just economists who are worried. In those investor forums you sent, people are seriously worried about a full-blown trade war, especially since Canada and Mexico have already said they'll hit back with their own tariffs. Some are even bringing up the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act from way back in 1930, the one that's often blamed for making the Great Depression worse.
Yeah, that's a pretty heavy comparison. Smoot-Hawley, it basically threw fuel on the fire of an already terrible economic situation, led to a whole spiral of retaliatory tariffs that just choked global trade. The question is, are we on that same path again?
And this is where things get really interesting. Some economists are saying this whole tariff strategy, it could actually work against another big part of the administration's economic plan, the tax cuts. If inflation goes up because of these tariffs, the Federal Reserve might have to raise interest rates, which could then slow down economic growth and cancel out any benefits from those tax cuts.
Yeah, it's a good point. Tax cuts, they're supposed to boost the economy, but if you're also raising costs for businesses and consumers with tariffs, you're basically working against yourself.
Sounds like a recipe for a bit of economic whiplash. What about the impact on specific industries? The reports seem to focus on tech, pharmaceuticals, and manufacturing as being particularly vulnerable.
Yeah, let's start with tech. A lot of those supply chains for things like smartphones and computers, they go right through China. Those tariffs on Chinese goods could make electronics more expensive and mess up the flow of important parts.
And I'm guessing pharmaceuticals are in a similar boat, especially with healthcare costs already being a major concern for a lot of people.
Absolutely. Tariffs could increase costs for those imported raw materials, which could then mean higher drug prices for people. And that's on top of all the other things that are already pushing healthcare costs higher.
And we can't forget manufacturing either. We saw how those steel and aluminum tariffs a few years ago hurt U.S. manufacturers. How are these new tariffs likely to play out for them?
It's probably going to make things harder for them. Those earlier tariffs already made things more expensive and made it harder for them to compete, especially those companies that rely on imported steel and aluminum. These new tariffs will likely just make things worse. And the potential for job losses in those industries, that's a real worry.
So we've got the administration saying these tariffs are necessary, but economists are warning about a potential economic storm. Where does public opinion fit into all of this?
Well, the data's interesting. Polls are showing that Americans are generally unsure about these tariffs. They're worried about prices going up and a potential trade war. But there's also a group that supports the idea of protecting American jobs and industries, even if it means paying a bit more.
So kind of a mixed bag of opinions, just like everything else with this situation.
Exactly. Seems like nobody really knows for sure how this is going to unfold.
Speaking of uncertainty, let's shift gears and think about how investors are reacting. What are they doing with their money in the face of all this?
Well, we're seeing a whole range of reactions in the markets, from just holding on to full on panic. Initially, the stock market response was pretty muted, but there's a lot of anxiety under the surface. As these tariffs become more real, there's a good chance we could see a pretty big downturn.
Feels like everyone's holding their breath, waiting to see what happens next.
Exactly. And that uncertainty is causing a lot of debate about the best investment strategies. Some people are sticking with what they have, hoping things will calm down. Others are shifting to more defensive stocks, things like consumer staples or healthcare. Those are seen as less vulnerable to economic turmoil.
Makes sense. And I bet some are just sitting on cash, waiting for things to settle before making any big decisions.
You're right. And then you have the ones who see this as a buying opportunity. They're betting on the market bouncing back or specific industries they think might actually benefit from the tariffs.
Like those domestic manufacturers who might see increased demand if people start buying fewer imported goods because of the higher prices.
Exactly. But it's important to remember that's a risky bet. Nobody knows for sure what's going to happen.
So for the everyday investor listening, what's the takeaway?
I'd say be careful. Do your research, understand how much risk you're comfortable with, and don't make any rash decisions based on fear or what other people are saying.
Solid advice. It's easy to get caught up in the headlines and market swings, but staying focused on your long-term goals, that's key.
Definitely. And remember, this whole situation is constantly changing. Things can change quickly, so stay informed and be prepared to adapt your strategy as you need to.
Okay, so we've laid out the basics. The tariffs themselves, the potential economic fallout, the public's divided opinions, and the nervous energy in the markets. But what does all this really mean for everyday life?
That's the big question, right? The truth is, the full impact of these tariffs, it's still unfolding. But at least we've given you some important information so you can understand what's at stake.
We've given you the pieces of the puzzle. Now it's up to you to put them together and make your own decisions.
And that's where the real deep dive begins.
But before we go too deep down that rabbit hole, let's step back and look at the bigger picture. What are the historical parallels here? Are there any lessons we can learn from the past?
That's a great question. And as we mentioned before, the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930, that's the big one that keeps coming up.
The one that a lot of economists blame for making the Great Depression even worse.
Exactly. And that's why there's so much worry about these new tariffs.
So, are we headed for another Great Depression?
It's impossible to say for sure. The global economy is way more complex and connected today than it was back then, but Smoot-Hawley teaches us a big lesson. Policies that try to protect one country can have devastating unintended consequences globally.
That's a sobering thought. So, where do we go from here? What are some of the scenarios that could play out?
Well, there are a few possibilities. Best case scenario. Maybe these tariffs do achieve some of their stated goals, like stemming the flow of illegal drugs and immigrants without causing too much economic damage. Maybe they could even pressure Canada, Mexico, and China to renegotiate those trade deals and make them more favorable to the U.S.
And in that case, maybe we end up with a more balanced trade relationship and see some growth in domestic industries.
That's the optimistic view. But there's also a real chance that these tariffs could backfire and we end up with a full-blown trade war. That would be bad news for everyone.
That's the worst case scenario, right? A global recession or even another depression.
Exactly. And it's a real possibility, especially if other countries start following the U.S.'s lead and put in place their own protectionist policies.
So we're at a crossroads here.
That's a good way to put it. The decisions made over the next few months will have a big impact on the global economy for years to come.
And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this part of our deep dive. We've covered a lot: the types of tariffs, the potential economic fallout, the public's mixed reactions, and the anxious energy in the markets. But there's still so much more to explore.
Definitely. In the next part, we'll take a deeper look at some of the long-term effects of these tariffs and explore some possible scenarios for the future of global trade. We'll also look at the history of tariffs and their impact on global trade, including a closer look at the infamous Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act.
So stay tuned. We'll be right back with part 2 of our deep dive into the complex world of tariffs.
So, as we dig deeper into this whole tariff thing, let's take a step back and look at the bigger picture, the historical context. Tariffs, I mean, they've been around forever, haven't they?
Yeah, it's not like they just invented them. What were they used for back in the day?
Well, they've been used for a bunch of different reasons, actually. Protecting industries within a country, generating revenue for the government, even as a tactic in those international disputes and disagreements. Think of them like a tool, an economic tool, but one that can be used in a lot of different ways, sometimes for good, sometimes not so much.
Okay, so that brings us back to that Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, the one that keeps coming up in all our sources. Seems like the classic example of how not to use tariffs. Can you remind us about the background of that particular act?
Yeah, it's definitely a cautionary tale. Smoot-Hawley, it was signed into law back in 1930, right smack in the middle of the Great Depression. It basically jacked up tariffs on like over 20,000 imported goods.
And a lot of people believe that it actually made the Great Depression worse, right?
Yeah, pretty much. It triggered a global trade war. Other countries, they retaliated with their own tariffs, which led to this sharp decline in global trade. And that just made economic activity plummet even further, making the depression even worse.
So, is what's happening now with these tariffs, is it similar to Smoot-Hawley?
Well, there are definitely some similarities. Both situations involve these big tariff increases on a wide range of goods, and both of them sparked retaliatory actions from other countries, which is never good.
But the global economy is a whole different animal today compared to the 1930s, right? We're so much more interconnected.
Absolutely. We have these intricate global supply chains now that cross multiple borders, sometimes even continents. Think about something as basic as a smartphone. The parts, they come from all over the place.
So if we have a trade war today, the consequences could be even more widespread and unpredictable than back then.
Yeah, that's a huge concern, and it's something that investors and policymakers are keeping a close eye on.
Okay, so let's shift gears for a second. Let's put those historical comparisons aside and talk about the potential long-term effects of these tariffs. What are some of the possible scenarios we might see play out?
All right, so best case scenario. Maybe these tariffs do manage to achieve some of those goals they laid out, like stemming the flow of illegal drugs and immigration without causing too much damage to the economy. Maybe they could even lead to those renegotiated trade deals, the ones the administration's been pushing for, deals that are more favorable to the U.S.
So a more balanced trade relationship, a boost for domestic industries, that's the ideal outcome, right?
Yeah, at least from the administration's perspective. But, and this is a big but, there's a real risk that this strategy could backfire. Instead of everyone working together, we could end up in this long, drawn-out trade war that hurts everyone involved. Disrupted supply chains, higher prices for consumers, maybe even a global recession. It's not a good look.
Definitely not. And what happens if that scenario plays out? What does it mean for the U.S.'s place in the global economy?
Well, if the U.S. keeps going down this protectionist path, it could really damage its influence in the global economy. Other countries might start to see the U.S. as unreliable, a risky trading partner, and look for other options.
So we could see new trade blocs and alliances forming, leaving the U.S. out in the cold.
Exactly. And we're already seeing some signs of that happening. China, for example, they've been actively pursuing trade deals with other countries, especially in Asia and Africa. They're not just sitting around waiting for the U.S. to make a move.
So the U.S. could end up isolating itself and losing its leadership position in the global economy.
It's a real possibility, and one that policymakers really need to think about carefully.
What about the impact on specific industries? We talked about some of those short-term effects, but what's a long-term outlook?
It's not all bad news, actually. Some industries might actually benefit from these tariffs over time. Those domestic manufacturers who compete with imported goods, they might see an increase in demand, which could then lead to more jobs and investment here in the U.S.
But those industries that rely heavily on imported parts or materials, they could be in trouble, right?
Absolutely. We could see job losses, prices going up, maybe even some businesses going under. It really depends on how individual industries are able to adapt.
So there's a lot of uncertainty and the potential for both good and bad outcomes.
Yeah, that's just the nature of these complex economic policies. There are always compromises, and those unintended consequences, they always seem to pop up.
And it's impossible to say for sure how it's all going to play out.
Exactly. But if we understand the historical context, the potential risks, and the different scenarios that could play out, at least we can make more informed decisions and be ready for whatever happens.
It's about staying informed, being flexible, and not panicking.
Exactly. We need to think critically and strategically about this whole thing.
Well said. Okay, so we've looked at the history of tariffs, potential long-term impacts, and the uncertainty surrounding all of this. Now, I want to get into the political side of things. What's the real motivation behind these tariffs, and how could they affect U.S. foreign policy?
That's a key part of this whole situation, and we'll dive into that right after.
Well, we'll just dive right in.
Perfect. Let's do it. We've talked about the economics, the history, all that, but let's be real, there's a whole political game going on here that we can't just ignore. What's the strategy? What's the end goal?
Well, trade and politics, they always go hand in hand. And these tariffs, they're a perfect example of that. It seems like there are a few things they're trying to achieve. One is that they want to reduce the trade deficit, with Canada, Mexico, and China. The idea is if we import less stuff from them, that deficit shrinks.
Yeah, it sounds simple enough, but I'm remembering those economic analyses. A lot of those experts said tariffs aren't really the best way to deal with trade deficits. Didn't they say those are usually caused by bigger economic forces?
Exactly. And some even said tariffs can actually make things worse. If tariffs drive up prices and make things less competitive, it could hurt our exports.
So it's not as easy as just throwing tariffs on everything and calling it a day. What are some of the other goals they might be going for? Well, another classic reason for tariffs is to protect domestic industries from that foreign competition. The idea of safeguarding American jobs, protecting American businesses from what some people call unfair competition, that's a message that resonates with a lot of people.
It's that whole Made in America thing,
Yeah.
right? But the reports we looked at, they also pointed out how tariffs can actually hurt the very industries they're supposed to be protecting. How does that happen?
Think about it. Tariffs make those imported materials more expensive, which means those made in America products become more expensive to make. So they become less competitive both here and when we try to sell them overseas. And then there are those retaliatory tariffs we talked about. If other countries hit back with tariffs on U.S. exports, it ends up hurting American businesses that are trying to sell their stuff in those countries.
So it's like a boomerang. You try to protect one thing and you end up hurting something else. What about the national security argument? The White House keeps bringing that up. How does that fit into all of this?
That's where things get a bit more complicated. They're saying these tariffs are about national security, that they're essential to stopping illegal drugs and immigrants from coming into the U.S. They even declared a national emergency at the border.
But the experts we looked at, they didn't all agree that tariffs are the best way to handle those issues.
Right. Many of them said tariffs don't actually get at the root causes of drug trafficking or illegal immigration. Plus, there's that concern that these tariffs are hurting relationships with our allies, like Canada and Mexico. That can make it harder to work together on things like border security and immigration.
So the potential problems with these tariffs, they go beyond just the economics. There are some serious foreign policy implications to think about here. So how are these tariffs actually playing out on the global stage?
Well, we're already seeing the consequences. Relations with Canada and Mexico are strained, and things with China, which is already in a trade war with the U.S., well, those tensions have escalated even more.
So are we at risk of isolating ourselves with these
Yeah.
tariffs?
Definitely a possibility, and that could have some big consequences down the line. It could make it harder for the U.S. to work with other countries on really important issues, things like climate change, nuclear nonproliferation, all sorts of things.
So something that starts as a trade disagreement could end up affecting the whole global landscape.
Exactly. And that brings up another important point, the use of executive power in trade policy. There's been a lot of debate about whether the president is overstepping with these tariffs.
I did see that in some of the sources. From what I read, the president does have quite a bit of power when it comes to imposing tariffs. But there are limits, right?
Right. And some legal experts are saying that declaring a national emergency to justify these tariffs, that might be pushing those limits.
I guess that's why we're seeing all these legal challenges. Some of them are still making their way through the courts.
Exactly. So it's possible the courts could end up overturning some of these tariffs. Definitely something to keep an eye on.
And what about Congress? Do they have a say in all this?
Oh, absolutely. The Constitution gives Congress the power to regulate commerce with other countries.
But my guess is they've given a lot of that power to the president in recent years.
Yeah, that's right. And that's led to concerns that the president has too much control over trade policy and might be using it as a political tool rather than a way to promote economic growth.
So some people are saying Congress needs to take back some of that control.
Exactly. And we're seeing more and more members of Congress from both sides of the aisle raising concerns about these tariffs and asking for more oversight of what the president is doing.
So this isn't just a partisan issue, it's a bigger discussion about the balance of power.
Exactly. And it has some serious implications for how U.S. trade policy will look in the future and the role the U.S. plays in the global economy.
Wow, we've really covered a lot today. We went from the basics of these tariffs to the potential fallout, both economic and political. We talked about public opinion and those global implications. Any final thoughts for our listeners as they try to make sense of this whole thing?
I think the big takeaway is that trade policy is complicated. There are always trade-offs, and you can almost guarantee there will be unintended consequences. We have to understand how complex this is and think critically about the choices being made.
It's about staying informed, being part of these conversations, and understanding that these decisions have real-life effects on all of us.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Yeah.
And we should always be careful of those who try to offer simple solutions or easy answers. These are complex issues that require careful thought and a willingness to understand all the different sides.
Well said. And on that note, I think we've come to the end of our deep dive into the world of tariffs. We've explored the economics, the history, the political motivations, and the possible consequences. It's a lot to process, but hopefully you're leaving with a better understanding of this complex and ever-changing situation.
We encourage you to keep learning about these issues and form your own opinions. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.